So Lori, I'm going to pass it to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anjali, and welcome everybody. We're so happy that you're here. People are slowly coming in as we all do from meeting to meeting. So we're just going to start with a Menti poll just to learn a little bit about you, as Anjali said. So for those of you who have used Menti before, what you do is you just open a new window. So I just put the link in the chat and you just follow that link to a window out. You can leave your Zoom window open. And then when you get to Menti, you just put in this, put in the code, which is in the chat. I can also read it to folks. It's 26627138. We already see people are answering the Menti. We apologize for some of the countries are very tiny. That's life sometimes on screen, but great. Thanks for letting us know where you're joining from. It's great to see people from lots of different places already. And we'll keep the Menti up. Wow, we have a big UK showing, it seems. So that's nice. And people, wow, okay. Great. So once you are finished with that question, oh, nice. Good to see everybody coming in, and then you can move to, people can keep joining. So we'll share results as we go, but you can start the next question. So you just forward in the Menti. Great, people have already started. We wanted to ask 2 words to describe feminist scale, and we've got fierce. That's a nice one. Powerful, people over economic unit, mix, ethical, inclusive, contextual. Ooh, fun. Word clouds are great. You can see them all moving up. Locally led, equality, principled, authoritarian, which is interesting, appropriate, value-led. Ooh, it's popping. Thanks all for, oh, it's kind of in the shape of a heart. Did you see that one? That was really nice for 1 second there. Beautiful, collaboration, exciting, radical. Great. That is really fun. So that will keep building and we'll continue to share that, but we'll move on, if you're finished with that, to the next question, which many of you have already done. So we're just trying to understand what people think of as challenges facing feminist scale. So you've got some choices there and you just kind of rank along the grid. Is, you know, what kind of change, a challenge from not a challenge at all to a significant challenge around sustained core funding, equitable partnerships, unrealistic timeframes and outcomes, the lack of quality programming to even take to scale, and the predominance of INGOs scaling rather than women's rights organizations. So we can see people are currently voting on that as well. So as people join, we'll continue to build up the Menti, but thanks a lot. That helps give us a sense of where you're from and some of the ideas in which you already associate feminist scale. And we'll continue to talk about that as we go through the presentation today. And thanks so much for joining. And I'll hand back over to Anjali.
Thank you, Lori. As we get these slides up, I just want to welcome everybody again to an invitation for scaling up from a feminist perspective. My name is Anjali Kohli, and I have the joy of moderating this event. For those of you who have just joined, we will be recording the event. Next. So the 11 members of the Community for Understanding Scale Up, also known as CUSP, are shown on this slide. In 2016, Raising Voices and Salamander Trust started informal conversations about the challenges and opportunities in their methodologies, SASA and stepping stones, being taken to scale. CUSP was formed as a group of organizations that developed effective methodologies to promote social norms change in order to prevent violence against women and girls and improve sexual and reproductive health and rights. In trusting relationships and dialogue, CUSP members shared our experiences with scaling our norms programs independently with donor support, as partners to other organizations and projects, and by others without our involvement. Throughout, CUSP members have returned to the importance of thoughtful scale, grounded in ethics, partnership, and an understanding of the essential elements of our methodologies. Next. CUSP has published several briefs, a peer review paper, and blogs, and led presentations outlining our learnings and recommendations. Prior to 2020, these publications offered important critiques about the development sector's approach to scale up and recommendations to transform the approach. On this slide, you see a graphic from our 2017 publication illustrating our collective insights to take social norms change approaches rooted in social justice practices and principles to scale. I won't unpack these learnings here. Those papers are available if you want to learn more. I have heard Adrienne Marie Brown speak of the imagination battle. Drawing from Claudia Rankine and Terry Marshall, Adrienne says, "We are living inside the imagination of other people." Quote, "Someone envisioned and imagined the world being the way it is now, in a way that we can take for granted. Someone constructed that. And if it can be imagined, then anything can be imagined," unquote. CUSP found ourselves in this place, living in and responding to other people's imaginations, which had become our reality. In 2020, we challenged ourselves to dream the world we want to see, one in which feminist values works with scale to reach gender equity. Throughout 2020 and 2021, we dreamed, deliberated, read, and wrote, releasing the thought piece and related blog we are discussing today. That brings me to the aim of this webinar, which is to summarize our discussions about the effective and ethical adaptation and/or scaling of our programs. We invite others who are working to reduce violence against women to join us in a critical examination of scale up. From here, a few CUSP members will present our collective deliberation. This will be followed by some reflections. We have also saved time for discussion with you. You can add any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be monitoring it, and we'll try to engage with as many of you as possible towards the end of the webinar. Now I'm handing over to Ellen Bajenja. Ellen, we're not hearing you yet.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes, greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to share our collective thoughts about scaling feminisms first, and then I'll go to scaling up as a conceptual metaphor. And then lastly, I will share our thoughts and reflections on scaling the business model. When we began, we recognized that we needed to come to a shared understanding of what we all meant when we used the term feminism. In our discussions of feminism, we placed particular emphasis on the inheritance of patriarchy as a historical force influencing the world we live in. We understand feminism as being born out of a fundamental recognition of the injustices fueled by patriarchy as an ideology and socially devised construct. Patriarchy continues to legitimize men's control over decision-making at the individual and structural levels, and directly and indirectly hinders efforts to create gender equity and equality. We found our own understanding of feminism was enhanced by the examination of the interaction of Western models of the so-called development and our programs in the Global South. We took into account the real contributions of the communities we partner with and inspiring feminist thinkers in the Global South. We recognize that feminism is the vehicle that will continually and systematically challenge this patriarchal system of domination in society. This debate led us to a discovery and examination of why we had not heard the term feminist scale anywhere, although we have heard much about and have regularly used the term feminist movement. So we as CUSP have decided to coin the phrase feminist scale, and we are explaining here what it means to us and how important we think it is in this webinar. Next. Moving on from our discussions on feminism, we embarked on a closer look at the meaning of the term scale up and realized that this is a conceptual metaphor. The essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. For instance, we all know laughter is the best medicine. But in their book, Metaphors We Live by Lakoff and Johnson, they argue that conceptual metaphors are far more powerful than one-off comparisons. They provide a structure of relationships and frequently a set of inferences, some of which operate invisibly. Basically, conceptual metaphors enable us to use our bodily experiences and provide us with ways to structure and understand the world around us, especially with abstract concepts such as growth. To illustrate the power of conceptual metaphors, take the abstract notion of life. You can't feel or see or touch life. So we compare it to experiences we have in the world. Here are two very different conceptual metaphors for life that people commonly use. On this slide, we notice that the hidden assumption in the life is a journey conceptual metaphor. There is a destination, a road or path, a barrier or challenge to be overcome. In individualistic societies, the journey is that of a single individual. Are you on the road to success? I'm off track. She is lost. He's found his way. In collectivist societies, the journey frequently seen as being undertaken with others is we shall overcome someday. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. But if you want to walk far, walk together. Notice in this slide how life is a dance brings up a different set of tacit and explicit assumptions. Here, coordinated interaction with others and the music are important. Being balanced and attuned to others is what is critical. For example, with others, one wants to sometimes lead, sometimes follow, supporting one another in the process. What is important about using conceptual metaphors for understanding abstract concepts is that one begins to realize how much is implied without being explicitly acknowledged. Notice how much value is carried into the metaphorical framework. Are you going up the ladder of success? In the life is a journey conceptual metaphor, or are you in step with your partners? In the life is a dance metaphor. We discovered that there are different conceptual metaphors for growth, and that scale up is one of them. We then focused on discussions of how scale up is a conceptual metaphor. Further exploring its origins, we realized that scaling originates in geography with map making, where it signifies increase or magnification of a space in a ratio between the map and the ground, that it could be 1 inch equals 50 miles, for example. But we noticed that the way the term scaling was being used was not restricted to map making. It was later taken up in the business world, where scaling up in business specifically means an increase in customers and products while decreasing investments or the unit cost of production in the name of efficiency and profit. This interpretation of scale was gradually adopted by the business world with additional implications and consequences, or entailments, as Lakoff and Johnson described them. In the images you see here, the thumbs up or the arrows pointing up represent positive movement, growth, or positive valuation. We noted in all these images that up and unconstrained growth are clearly good. So everyone would certainly want to scale up. So we realized that there is pressure around us all to scale up all the time, even with the pressure of, for example, hitting daily targets in our programs. And we often lose sight of the importance of the process. On closer examination, we found troubling entailments, as Lakoff and Johnson called them, or implications or consequences of the scale-up metaphors as it is used in business, for when it is applied to changing social norms, especially harmful ones. We thus fleshed them out as follows, following the business model. One has designed a product, which is in this case could be a training manual that has worked in one particular setting. So elements are extracted from the manual and packaged as a product for scale up in another context at a cheaper unit cost. This product is thus exported and transported, often by the outsiders. It is frequently used without understanding of the original context and any contact with the originators. Then that the product is worthy of scaling is determined by a reductive set of measurements based on the quality of the product or manual or its implementation, rather on the lower unit cost with resulting more economical outcomes. These measurements then apply to new settings where the products often need to be engineered or modified so that they appear to produce similar results. So that's how the business model is used. The engineering or modification required often involves losing the soul or the values on which the program was developed, which deeply affects the quality of the work and its impact. Now I'm handing over to Alice Webb.
Thank you, Ellen. Conceptual metaphors also structure how we conceptualize our world order. Here we can see a map of the world in a form we're all very unfamiliar with. It's so weird to look at it in its so-called upside down form, and yet this is our planet, which we all call home. It just goes to show how deeply entrenched and embedded in our psyche the stated wisdom is that north is up, normal, natural, good, etc. And looking at the map upside down, so to speak, can feel a real surprise. Yet north equals up is, again, only a convention, a social construct. This use of north equals up in maps really only became widely established in the 1400s, which is when the so-called voyages of discovery with European mass expansion of their powers began. It was this view of the world, calling north equals up equals civilized, and its implication, which is south equals down equals uncivilized, which drove the perfect storm in this next slide. These two, north equals up and unconstrained growth equals good, conceptual metaphors emerged and fed into each other from at least the 15th century, with European powers competing in a race to claim sovereignty over other people in the global south, over their lands and their natural worlds, whom Western powers merely viewed as resources to be exploited. These conceptual metaphors have provided the legitimation for Western economic expansion. You can see in this diagram here what we discussed over the months as the consequences of Western powers' assumptions back then, that they were separate from and superior to not only nature and the plant and animal worlds, but also separate from and superior to people, especially people in the global south. This European and later North American belief system, by othering and objectifying other people and their lands and possessions, validated and fueled their efforts to conquer, enslave, and exploit other people and plunder their natural worlds for the benefit of Western profit and gains in the name of civilization. Our longer thought piece on which this webinar is based explains how analyzing conceptual metaphors and their entailments can enhance our understanding of our geopolitical background. These assumptions have essentially shaped our Western social norms, where it has for so long been taken as natural and given in the West that political and economic growth and expansion equals good, and that north equals up equals good. Yet now, a growing mass of opinion is rightly questioning and challenging these values and assumptions, and is now seeing that unceasing economic and social expansion are not necessarily natural or good. We need a different way of thinking about growth. Much as they were taken for granted by so many of our predecessors in the global north in the past, patriarchy, genocide, enslavement, colonialism, sexism and racism have no place whatsoever in any society anywhere. So we needed to examine our own assumptions and norms around scale up equals good, which are so rooted in these historical values of the Western world. We need to question deeply our assumptions about which way up that map should be. The good news is that conceptual metaphors and the social norms that they prop up can also be replaced by other metaphors and other social norms, far more just, equitable, and sustainable. But before we go on to that, Tina Musuya will describe some of the consequences for us of how these Western entrenched conceptual metaphors of good equals up and good equals north have affected scaling up of our approaches.
So we explored many implications of the use of this metaphor in our work of unending growth equals good and the resulting drive for increased efficiency through reducing costs. In practical terms, in social norm change programming, this is, for example, can take the form of shortening, simplification, and mechanization of in-depth trainings of facilitators of complex approaches, leaving them at a crossroads where they are not sure which direction to take. And evaluation methods that are used to assess the success of such approaches use externally defined goals. They value formal quantitative methods over participatory qualitative methods and favor short-term objective unit costs over long-term, more qualitative outcomes. So the mechanized quantified worldview of global business, which is essentially designed to make profit, has predominated. It measures progress in terms of continued unceasing growth of GDP around the world to service countries' compound debt repayments to the global north. This depends on continued extraction of fossil fuels and industrial processes, which are driving catastrophic climate change, and social deprivation, including increasing violence against women. A different perspective offers us a qualitative worldview of ancient wisdoms still prevalent in many communities where we work and where we live, which recognize people as belonging to and being part of the world around us, in balance with rather than trying to control nature, where the process, as in the dance that was described above, is seen as being as important as the arrival, where instead of unlimited linear growth, growth is viewed as something cyclical and sustainable through waxing and waning, like the seasons which govern all our lives and well-being. I will also speak through this ecological metaphors for scale. We decided next to explore further what an ecological model might look like. These images here reflect the natural life cycle of us all, which grows from infancy, matures, and then fades away again as we age and die. Like new leaves growing to maturity and then fading again and transforming into rich compost for new life to grow in a constant cycle. Like this new fern always unfurling as old generations support them and then fade away around them. Like these vast stretching interconnected tree roots with underground root systems which have always been there, but the importance of which Western science is only beginning to understand. These images reflect the deep interconnectedness of us with nature, and we also can envision the ecological relationships within the communities with whom we partner. In all our rich discussions, we thus recognized how this ecological model felt much more fruitful for us as people, working with people, in a way which the Western unlimited growth model does not. The ecological metaphor really helped us see and embody these values of deep-rootedness, interconnectedness, and complexity as key elements to be celebrated and as an integral part of sustainable scaling process, rather than awkward challenges to be controlled and minimized. So we also moved along to look at the 7 elements of a feminist approach to scale. The first one is effective in-depth pre-program consultation with all those who are and will be affected. I mean, this programming is part of the social change process. Second, commitment to a sustained, safe process defined by collaboration, mutual respect, and balanced power with an adequate budget to support such processes. Third is culturally sensitive approaches to adaptation with emphasis on learning and responsiveness. The fourth is high quality, in-depth ongoing training and mentoring. Fifth is accountability to communities with an emphasis on those most affected. The sixth is facilitation of connections with local governing bodies. And lastly, is all this process is political in nature. I will also quickly talk you through what we are looking at, visioning as feminist scale that supports movements. As you can see in this infographic, this infographic that we developed is to share with you some feminist values, some of the elements that we have described above. For instance, we emphasize in our thought piece the importance of always starting with offering our support to local women rights movements who have already taken on the burden of tackling the root causes of injustice in their lives, instead of flying in like a parachute regiment, which can often undermine or appropriate all the deep community-based organizing as its own. We emphasize the importance of recognizing the interconnectedness between gender transformation, human rights, climate justice, and sustainable cyclical economies. To effect ongoing sustainable growth, a cyclical model enables the work to be transformative by redistributing power, to foster change at the root, fostering self and collective care, being inclusive and valuing all voices. All this is grounded in relationships of trust, collaboration and transparency, accountability, care and joy. We have developed a simple brief that describes the feminist values, essentials, components of feminist scale and the outcomes it can achieve, as well as recommendations for colleagues working at various levels on scale. Now, other CUSP members will share how these concepts can and have been applied when scaling social norm change programming. Now I'm handing you on to Hawa Kagoya, who will look more closely at one of the elements of this image. Over to you, Hawa.
Hi, greetings, everyone. I am Hawa Kagoya, and I represent Center for Domestic Violence Prevention, CEDOVIP in CUSP. I'll speak to community-led programming as an essential element in feminist scaling. CEDOVIP is a feminist non-government organization that seeks to prevent violence against women by transforming underlying power imbalances between men and women and harmful social norms. At CEDOVIP, we recognize the overarching role that the community with whom we are working has in scaling norms change when it takes lead. In our work at CEDOVIP, we invest significant energy and resources in helping programmers and natural leaders within the community across the ecological model or the circle of influence to lead the transformation process. This is a systematic way of working in communities. It requires time, significant investment to build relations of trust and mutual respect. And it comes with benefits of transforming a project into activism. It becomes less and less about CEDOVIP and more about the leadership and activism of community members. So while it is organic, it is much richer, more authentic, and with a long-lived impact beyond the project timeframe. Having community members at the forefront increases ownership of the intervention because the community identifies with it and finds their agency to resolve their own problems. This enables tapping into local knowledge, which not only grounds the intervention, but also enables the activists and allies to lead all the activism and efforts to prevent VAUG in their own informal way because it is a lived experience. CEDOVIP's ongoing transformative training and mentorship to community members enables them, therefore, to build their confidence and facilitation skills with their neighbors, friends, and family. Through this, they frame issues from their local languages, and they understand and enable the community members to connect with the problem of violence against women. And they also feel the collective responsibility to act as the community. We have then found that this community-driven activism strengthens and empowers the community to formalize and sustain actions to prevent VAUG every day. CUSP discussions have affirmed the importance of community leadership because it not only strengthens ownership and contextualizes change, but also paves way for sustainability of the change. The ripple effect is inevitable, therefore, because there is scaling from individuals to relationships to community, which includes leaders and institutions. Next, you will hear from Diane Gillespie.
Hi, I'm Diane Gillespie, and I represent Tostan and CUSP. Tostan is an NGO that offers the Community Empowerment Program, a 3-year human rights-based educational initiative in resource-poor communities in West Africa. Over the last decade, I have served as a volunteer for Tostan in many capacities, most recently in monitoring, learning, and evaluation. At the beginning of our CUSP discussions, I thought of scale up in the framework that we have come to characterize in the business metaphor. Yes, figure out how to adopt and grow this program, scale it up. I joined CUSP hoping others had a magic bullet for scaling up social norm change. None of us did. Instead, in our early discussions, we found shared values and identified common problems with scaling up. In our recent discussions, as we identified and fleshed out the entailments of the business scale-up metaphor, I became convinced that this metaphorical framing was a problem. During these CUSP discussions, I was reading interview and focus group transcripts collected from Tostan's program and non-program participants, and began to think about the importance of the local context and its multi-dimensional aspects as described by them. They portrayed a complex network of relationships, much like the tree roots that interrelate underground. Those relationships sustained the community as they made changes that increased gender equity and community well-being. What was important to them was the dialogic process, which took time. Yet people were coming to Tostan and asking for portions of its program without regard to the preparatory work that must go on within the community in order for those modules to be effective. Historically, we in Tostan have struggled to articulate the dynamic complexities in communities given the pressure to extract something, even a process, from our entire program. The pressure creates misunderstandings, but can also lead to harms, the most egregious of which might be the attempt to engineer social situations by program implementers so that single factors can be measured by outsiders. The ecological metaphor enables us to highlight the importance of recognizing contextual complexities as critical for sustainable scale. For me, in conversations I have with others who want Tostan to scale up, I say, let's think about the metaphor and its entailments. If you respect the ecological system that is in place in the communities before you enter, you can engage with the community in ways that nurture what is working well and discover what community members themselves think is not working. That partnership will allow the community to make changes over time that increase peace, well-being, and gender equity long after the partnership ends. I now turn to Trisha Navrati.
Hi, everyone. I'm Trisha Navrati and I represent Raising Voices in CUSP. I will share reflections on the importance of two essential elements supporting feminist scaling: responsive funders and iterative learning. SASA is an evidence-based community mobilization approach developed by Raising Voices to prevent violence against women. It has spread to communities in over 30 countries worldwide over the past decade. There are various approaches to taking effective methodologies to scale, and several have been applied to SASA with varying degrees of success. After many requests for SASA from organizations in Spanish-speaking Latin America, Raising Voices decided to take a more hands-on approach to its introduction there, attempting to provide an example of what feminist scale can look like. In partnership with Vista Hermosa and several of their regional partners interested in violence prevention programming, we undertook a full language and cultural adaptation of SASA Together, the revised version of SASA, in Spanish for Mexico and Central America. Through this process, several of these groups became interested in using SASA Together in their communities. Therefore, we partnered to scale SASA Together in Mexico and Honduras. The facilitators of success include: 1, initiation of interest in using SASA Together from activist organizations themselves. 2, a funder committed to both sustained funding to implementation and technical assistance. 3, technical assistance from Raising Voices staff who are from and live in the region, know the culture and context. 4, values alignment of all partners to the values of SASA Together. And lastly, a commitment to work together in openness, transparency, and mutual respect. It is an encouraging example of feminist partnership for feminist scale. Now, I'd like to also share about the learning posture we adopt at Raising Voices for adapting and scaling our evidence-based methodologies, SASA Together and the Good School Toolkit. Learning is a core thematic area organization-wide, and this deep commitment has strengthened our programming by enabling us to work with partners, communities, and schools to better address critical questions around the process and impact of our programming. Through iterative learning that is both action-oriented and aligned with feminist principles, we strive to create tight feedback loops which allow our learning to inform the scaling and adaptations of our methodologies in different contexts and modalities. To sum up, in our experience, both responsive funding and iterative learning are essential elements of feminist scale.
Thank you, Trisha, and to all the members of CUSP for this presentation. You have now heard from several members of CUSP who have shared the reflections and work of our community over these past 2 years. It is important to also hear from individuals external to CUSP who are committed to gender equity and scale. Next, we have 2 panelists shown here who will offer their reflections on CUSP's vision of feminist scale and the presentations you have heard today. Before introducing our first panelist, I want to remind you that we have saved time for discussion. Please add any questions or comments in chat and we'll come back to them shortly. Next, Sybil Chidiak, a program officer with the Gender Equality Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, will start us off with her reflections. Sybil, off to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to serve as a commentator to this paper. It is an honor to be with you all today. I truly appreciate the knowledge and rich resources that CUSP has cultivated and crafted to share into the development space. First, I would like to say that this paper, the collection of sources researched, as well as presentations made today, represent a masterclass in development, a particularly important one for a range of actors who engage from an international perspective and are in the process of shifting towards a more gender inclusive or feminist approach. I've truly gained new insights on how to better make the case for deep-seated change and have been inspired by CUSP member organizations for holding fast when the powers that be are asking to fit for transformative social norms and initiatives into a specific framework. So I've been asked to serve as a commentator on the Scaling Up from a Feminist Perspective paper, and I'm honored to be able to share with you some key aspects of the paper that I thought most resonated with my 20 years experience in international development, to my most challenging and longest engagement, which focuses on advancing women's economic empowerment. So I'd like to share with you 3 components I could not stray away from as I delved into this paper on feminist scale, and my reflections and emphasis on what I'm constantly or should be more mindful of. First, unpacking the rationale and approach for scaling up or growth and development is an important starting point for any strategy conceptualization. As we read in the paper, the term scaling up and development often takes the de facto business definition, which in part focuses on decreasing costs to reach the maximum amount of people in a geographical zone. It's a focus on numbers, geographies, efficiencies, crafting an approach or a mechanism that we can then take and replicate with adaptations in another context rather than on the process of scale. The paper notes that we have found in our own practice that when others take our programs and from them design a system to export into new communities, they have more often than not failed. This is partly because they are predicting based on a model of mechanistic homogeneity, rather than on the real and varied lived experiences of diverse community members themselves. I thought it was important to reread that quote from the paper. We actually need to normalize a practice that makes us pause as international development actors and truly understand the cultural realities within communities and what they are moving towards or against and how they are currently organizing, and be acutely cognizant of who we are funding or partnering with to advance that partnership. We need to ask them, what is their mission? If it's a partner, what approach do they take on when working with any population? How do they engage in community entry? Are they from the area or do they reside in the communities we are partnering with? Measurement and how we know we've progressed also needs to be re-examined and normalized in a new way. The paper notes that there is a dominance of randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews of such trials as the gold standard. However, these describe the what rather than the how or why, and are not well suited to addressing social change. So it's important to embed evaluative approaches that help understand the pathways taken to the change that has manifested, and not primarily or even solely value the focus on the metrics and quantifiable measures that we can speak to in a consolidated, benchmarked way. Last, under this reflection, there's a need to start with the whole picture of who we are intending to reach. In my work, it is predominantly women and girls, but often when I envision the women and girls, I picture the whole community and the various interactions the women and girls have with people, leadership, and institutions. And this picture reminds us not to take a siloed approach to effective women's economic empowerment programming, to look at the various social economic determinants of livelihoods that combined affects a women's ability to engage in work or enterprises, bring attention to intersectionality of violence, health, political participation, access to resources, such as credit and land and many more, and the people and institutions that engage on these intersectionalities to truly affect change. A dominant perspective brought out throughout the paper, one that is vital to an ecosystem approach, is one that calls for the dismantling the emphasis on individual and structural focus for behavior change and ensure relation aspects are included. So the second emphasis emanating from the paper is that frameworks for scale should focus on the ecosystem rather than just solely on the efficiencies of expanding individual outcomes. So what does this mean to me? This means that the shared practices of 6 interconnected insights to take social norms change approaches rooted in social justice practices and principles to scale are important to follow at all times, not just for gender-based programming, but for development programming. 3 of those principles stick out to me in particular. They are first, to prioritize accountability to communities. So working with communities who will lead and determine what they are ready to take on and change. Second, to ensure adequate time and funding for programming. And on this point, I constantly go back in my head to the phrase, gender equality can't wait. According to the World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Gender Gap Report, it is estimated that it will take 135.6 years to close the gender gap worldwide. It will take 145.5 years to attain gender parity in politics, 267.6 years to close the gender gap in economic participation and opportunity, another 14.2 years to completely close the gender gaps in educational attainment. We clearly don't have the luxury of adding more time to this clock. COVID-19 already added 26 years to the economic estimates to attain gender parity. So it's important to ensure that programming that is being designed takes into account all the principles noted, so that the change that is trying to be effected takes hold, is sustained, and ultimately reduces the time on the clock and does not add more time, as we would have to find a way to go back and fill in the gaps. And third, maintain fidelity to the elements of the original methodology. This is one aspect where I have to commend and highlight the CUSP members' work, and in particular Tostan, who the foundation is partnered with. Time and time again, donors and partners have asked Tostan and other organizations to shorten their methodologies, extract components, or identify the norms and outcomes that will be changed in a shortened time frame. Let's do it in 2 years' time, 1 year's time, 6 months. But ultimately, fidelity to the element of the original methodology is what contributes to the success of communities. This needs to be said more and understood by many donors, because the lack of understanding this is what contributes to the business framework drive for scaling up. My last point, feminism. Feminism is on feminism, and I think feminism is not fully accepted in the realm of development. Gender or women-centric approaches is still preferred. As we read in the paper, feminism questions and challenges this patriarchal system of domination and the business-like framing of development as a damaging worldview. This notion is still contentious in the space of development, and one that many organizations walk a fine line. There are alternative terms that are accepted, which allow safety, avoidance of any backlash, and as a result, cultivate misunderstandings. They end up being misleading and in some instances, or just worse, or even worse, just a label. When we skirt the term we truly mean, we then also create ways to deliberately not work on what truly needs to be addressed. With this, we should be mindful of what we say our programs are going to do and the focus of our work. We should take a mindful and intentional approach to the terms we use in our work and what we are trying to promote and dismantle, and again, who we are working with. This paper also elaborates beautifully the missed opportunity in designing and engaging in feminist development. It notes that ecological models of community development recognize the dynamic interplay among individuals, their families and neighborhoods, their material resources, their local organizations and governing bodies, and the larger structural determinants or institutions of their society. The ecosystem includes the local, regional, and national government and market actors, and finding ways to combine and synergize efforts with the communities rather than disaggregating relationships. This part is what I find where we struggle with the most. And we see this at all levels, not just in philanthropy or between implementation actors. Oftentimes when working with a ministry, one department is not fully aware of the programming or policy related activities that another department is working on in the same communities. Coordination and collaboration mechanisms should not be undervalued or under-resourced. In practicing such a mindful, inclusive, community-driven approach, this can help avoid alienation, duplicate efforts, and ensure that contextualization so that it can motivate meaningful community organization and action necessary to affect sustained change. So in closing, I'd like to share that I've often said to my friends and family, I hope my work in development would not be something that my kids inherit, that all that I do during my lifetime would end the need for development. In reading this paper, I had the sense that if we actually took a feminist perspective to development and scaling up, we might actually eliminate the need for my job in a few decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Sybil. Next. And now we will hear from Laura Giron of ExpandNet. Laura has provided technical support for Scale Up since 2007. She will offer her reflections. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and to listen to everybody. So one of the things that struck me in reading the paper is that I suspect many, if not most of the people I've worked with over the last 25 years, and probably most of you participating in the webinar, fall somewhere on a continuum where on the one side are folks like CUSP members scaling complex norms shifting interventions, and on the other, the for-profit GDP focused economist types. And Then there are the multitudes of us working in nonprofit organizations who fit somewhere in the middle and who want to see humankind and especially womankind advance along the lines that Sybil was talking about. So for those of us in the middle, I have a big takeaway from CUSP's body of work, and that is we can all do better. We can do better at keeping women and girls at the center of all that we do, better at interrogating our approaches to ensure that repercussions of what we're scaling serves to advance women and girls, and above all, does no harm. This to me represents a feminist scaling agenda, and we all can do our best to systematically try to game out any possible scenarios whereby women and women's interests can be advanced or hampered by our scale-up work. And so in reflecting on my work with family planning programs around the world, I like to think that this is how we've been working, but perhaps we could still do better. And perhaps this is felt most acutely when we think about the very real tension between more rapidly addressing the need for life-saving interventions and doing so in an examined and holistic way. A key understanding to expand it has been always that simplification is a critical step for scale up, and because simpler interventions are easier to scale. And we don't want to wait indefinitely to reach everyone with all of our important and life-saving interventions. Still, as a core principle, Expand and CUSP strongly agree on the fact that it's essential to be vigilant during simplification, so we don't lose focus on what is sometimes referred to as the software aspects of our interventions, especially when we know that it was those aspects that made the package initially succeed. Thus, maintaining focus and ensuring the integrity of those aspects during the scale-up process is critical, because it's often these less tangible and more challenging components that are the first to be dropped during scaling up. And therefore, making strategic trade-offs is an inherent part of the scaling up process. And we have to be thoughtful about which ones we're making and why. I've personally been enjoying tracking CUSP's fascinating journey over the recent years. I found the paper extremely thought-provoking in its exploration of language and metaphor. But in the face of adaptation, translation, and constant evolution of language, for me, what matters still more is the spirit within which we're working. My baseline assumption is that those of us working in the nonprofit world are here because we're trying to benefit more people, while also seeking to ensure that the integrity of our interventions isn't sacrificed on the altar of their scale up. We also know that slow and plodding progress will not achieve our sustainable development goals in a timely fashion. And I want the world to achieve them. And I'm concerned about how we're going to get there if we continue to accept only slow progress. So I wanted to turn to the 7 elements of a feminist approach to scale up that were highlighted in the paper and today's remarks. So those of us in the Expanded Secretariat, we can wholeheartedly endorse these and feel that they're exactly how we would hope to see all scaling up work undertaken, not just norms shifting interventions. In most of the reproductive health projects with whom we've been working over the years, colleagues have certainly tried to work within this frame and spirit, perhaps not to the same depth as norm shifting interventions may need to, but we try, and I want to give credit where credit is due. And yet I can say again that imposing a feminist lens on all of our important work, I think we can do better. Lastly, I want to highlight the relevance of local testing as a prerequisite for scale up, and how even with an ever-growing and evolving canon of global best practices, from an expanded perspective, there is no country on earth in which a global best practice can simply be adopted and wholesale and implemented universally. For me, this is where the 7 elements can appropriately guide how any best practice can and should be operationalized locally. This is a nuance that we can easily lose track of in the effort to expand access to life-saving best practices. Because while best practices can advance health and development more rapidly, the onus is on us to apply a feminist lens, again, to ensure no harm comes from implementation. And for me, this includes resisting the continued implementation of one-off projects that are not likely to be sustained. Because as CUSP says, communities are not testing grounds. And thus, whatever we are implementing, if successful, we owe women and communities an obligation to ensure sustainability and scale up. And we can no longer settle for health and development projects that lack such a focus. Because from my perspective, that is doing harm by creating expectations and, worse yet, wasting precious resources that could otherwise be put towards work that's more skillfully applying a scaling mindset. So I want to thank CUSP for your leadership and to everybody for being here today, because it means that we are all working in the same spirit. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. It has been such a pleasure for me to hear these reflections and to initiate this conversation of how we can move forward some of this thinking in our work. CUSP really started this journey with an idea that we wanted to reinvigorate the field, seep these ideas into the community, and work together to realize them. So now as we move into this discussion portion, I want to encourage all the CUSP members and Sybil and Laura to come on camera. We've reserved a lot of time now to engage in discussion, and I see a few questions in chat. Leah, can you stop sharing the slides and we can see the panelists come up? Thank you. If you add more questions in chat, we'll be monitoring it. But I'm going to start us off with a question here. I think a lot of the thinking and the conversation we've heard so far has really brought forth the vision of feminist scale and how we think this can really have a meaningful impact in the relationships we have in community and future development. But we've also brought forth some of the tensions that can hold us back, these tensions of power and funding and time. So I'm curious to hear from some CUSP members. How can funders, international organizations, feminist and organizations and others work to achieve this vision? More specifically, what can each of us do differently? And I'll start by offering that question to some of our members in the Raising Voices office. Ellen or Tina, Tabisha, Hawa, does one of you want to start us off?
Thank you very much for that thought-provoking question. I think there are several things that need to be done towards that. One is engaging closely in reflections like these to, prompt us to think differently and to reflect on, because all our intentions are good and no one works outrightly to cause harm. So when we reflect and engage with colleagues who have been doing this work for a long time and working with the communities, I think that's the very best starting point. Also bringing colleagues who are the originators of these models, because they did it in collaboration with the communities where this work has been implemented, so that they tell us the what and how, because the how is extremely important. And then we figure out together, how can this beautiful work be taken to scale? Because then we shall be knowing the core components of that make that particular model successful. And then also having clear steps of how that work can be adapted in a different context, and the kind of technical support and resources needed to take it to scale. So together we can continue to pilot, listen to each other, and build on what we already have here. If someone else can add to what I've shared.
Thank you, Tina. Go ahead, Hawa.
I was just going to complete Tina and add also on the aspect of the why, because we have found the why to be very strong when it comes to scaling, even within the communities that we are working. When the community understands why they are being brought on board and why a given program is being initiated and why their involvement and participation is key. When they appreciate the why, then it becomes almost automatic that there is buy-in and then need to actually scale it beyond themselves to their relationships, communities, and the wider spaces with whom they interact. So that makes scaling almost automatic because the why has been understood and the positive benefits that are attached to the program are actually speaking directly to their lives and well-being. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I saw a question in chat from Amanda. I'm going to pass it to Lori to summarize the question and start us off.
Sure, thanks, Anjali, and thanks, Amanda. Yeah, we also, I think all of us in CUSP have felt from our various positions, like, how can we make a difference? How can we use our space and our platform to influence when we feel, 20 steps away from sometimes of the bigger discussions that are happening? And so I think one of the things that we have been trying to do is one, like really garner collective voice. CUSP is small, we like to say scrappy, because we're just really people who, didn't feel like we had a voice independently. And yet joining our voices together has really allowed us to put forth ideas that, frankly, are taken more seriously if just one of us were to say them. So really thinking about allies in your own space and how to start building relationships with those allies, and then reaching out, like we have Sybil here, there's also other funders on the call and others who couldn't make it, who are really aligned, and they're working within systems that are very challenging, but are aligned. And so if we have relationships and can engage them on some of these issues at a conceptual level, not narrowing down everything to funding, but really wrestle with some of these issues, and then provide examples. One of the important things on the presentation is we really wanted to show how these ideas can be applied, because they can all sound quite lofty, right? If we're just thinking about up here, but then what does it practically mean to apply some of these ideas? And that, some of them are going to require change, which is hard and going to be uncomfortable and not make everybody happy. But that we actually, if we build up our collective voice within our own communities and relationships that we have, then sometimes we can expand the space more than we think we could. And we're, Leah put up the slide at the end around, if you are interested in engaging more in this conversation, we're interested within CUSP to engage with others, because we feel like that's, that's our collective strength and power. So feel free to write, and we'll put the email address again in the chat, but we want to, encourage new relationships and new bridge building as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori. I see another question in chat, and I'm going to ask Diane Gillespie and Sybil to offer us some reflections. So Diane Gardsbane notes that she's very interested in hearing how any of you have successfully pushed back from funder demands, and that can be an obstacle to our achieving change. So I'm asking Diane if you can give us an example from your work, and Sybil, how can you create space within funder organizations for pushback? So let's start with Diane. Diane, you're muted.
Thank you for that question, very thoughtful. So Tostan has had asks for particular issues. And as I said, Tostan is a holistic program. So we have just had the courage to say, no, we don't just do a particular, we're not focused on just one particular issue. Our experience is that the whole community and our holistic program is what leads to social norm change. And that just takes a lot of courage and a lot of hope that there will be donors who understand the ecological model, essentially. So Sybil, maybe I'll from that go to you.
Yeah, thanks, Diane, and thanks for the question. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, if I can be honest, in partnering with Tostan, if I can use that example more clearly, and looking at how to build out Tostan's engagement with more communities in new countries and new areas. So talking about that textbook definition of scaling up, this is where we come across partners who are asking to shorten the model, if they could take key elements of Tostan's work and not the full 3-year CEP, or looking at just other ways of really changing the original methodology. And I think what I have seen is that I've been supportive in pushing back with Tostan, because I understand what it looks like when you engage fully in a 3-year program and you implement the methodology in a sequence approach, and you let the community decide the directions that they're going to take it. So I do think one of the most important things is ensuring that there is some sort of field visit, that you understand exactly what does this model or this methodology look like on the ground. Why is it important to implement it in the way that it has been implemented? So one of the strong aspects of Tostan's work is actually bringing donors, bringing partners to the training center in Thiès in Senegal, and then from there going to communities to which Tostan has engaged with, and letting the community speak for themselves. So I think this is really about education, creating space, and understanding around the model. And I think this is what, a lot of funders stuck in a sort of, we got to get money out the door, or we have to achieve XY outcomes in X years. And so we tend to kind of speed through things, but just taking time to pause and understand the different approaches that are out there that are being community driven, that do take a longer, time, it's worth the effort. I mean, it goes back to some of the points that I made in my remarks that I won't need to repeat now, but it is about that education, that sensitization. It's about seeing the work on the ground and seeing where the community wants to take it. Because if it's taken by the community, then only then will you have lasting, sustained change, and they will take it in the directions that are meaningful to them, and they know their priorities better than we do.
Thank you, Sybil and Diane. I see another question in chat that I'm going to point to Ellen for. Ellen, I'll read it out. Khadija says, promotion of competition also seeps into organizations and becomes a blockage to integrated work, which could create more meaningful change and pushes us into recreating toolkits which already exists rather than implementing programs. So I think Khadija is getting at this tension of competition, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Khadija, for that question. In my view, the way that we are working as CUSP already presents a clear approach to addressing issues of competition. We all have different approaches, which we reflected on and came up with the 7 elements of the feminist approach, which really bring us together. I think the way that we can handle competition among organizations, the beginning, as the case of Sasa was presented, is a realization of the need to keep the ethos or the core aspects of an approach. And once an organization has come to that realization, then I think that's I don't want to call it a magic bullet, but it's the way that an organization will respect and keep and uphold the fidelity of an approach. I'll go back to saying that it's true, and I agree that competition is there. But once we go over these organizations appreciating the need to scale up using the key elements, the minimum key aspects that we need to consider, that's the beginning point of breaking that competition. So I think for me, I don't know whether I've answered Khadija's question well, but the issue is, are we changing as organizations? if we have that space that has organizations that are competing, the first step is for those organizations to believe in the fidelity of the approaches. Then they will not murder them, they will not change them. They will look at them as a way of comprehensively following the ethos, the spirit, and then also join us in the struggle of saying, I'm not going to murder this methodology, I would like to use it as it is. And once we collectively, I mean, there is power in numbers. Once there are more organizations that are convinced about really keeping the fidelity of an approach, then I think we would go over this aspect of competition. It's all about a collective effort and the power in the numbers.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's a very thoughtful response. There's another question here in chat that I'll read out. Alice, I'm hoping you can respond for us. So this is from Stephen Hunt. My question relates to scaling multi-layered interventions, such as social norms change, plus sexual and reproductive health and economic strengthening. Each intervention has a different scaling logic. How can implementing partners start using the feminist approach as a tool for maintaining fidelity when scaling multi-layered interventions?
Thank you, Stephen. That's a great question. And I think my response is really that actually we've all got to embrace this. We've all got to embrace the fact that actually thinking in a siloed way just isn't appropriate anymore. You know, we're all facing an incredible crisis of climate change. And climate change is an integral part of this conversation that we're having today. You know, it's because of the geopolitical model that we were talking about, the belief system, the ideology which has driven all of this, and the development of neoliberalism, the development of this huge north-south debt process, and the fact that all of the global south countries who are in receipt of debt are basically on a treadmill, an unending treadmill of having to go on increasing global domestic product in order to service not the debt itself, but actually the interest, the compound interest which has accrued on the debt over the years. And because everybody's having to go on increasing that GDP in that unrelenting growth model, it means that there's going on extraction in so many countries of natural resources. There's going ongoing production in many countries of those fossil fuels or of minerals or whatever, which is also adding to pollution. And then there's ongoing pressure on scarce resources, of privatization of scarce resources such as fuel, such as food, such as water. And this inevitably has a knock-on effect on women's unpaid collecting of these things and of their caring, none of the unpaid work of women is included in GDP. And so this goes on putting increasing pressure on women in terms of less and less and less time to have to travel further and further afield to collect water, to collect fuel, to find food. And it makes them increasingly stressed, physically as well as mentally stressed, which adds also then to their vulnerability to violence against them for not having produced the food on time, for not turning up when they should to do things or to go to hospital or whatever. And so this sounds complicated, but actually the reality is that all of this is making climate change worse, as we know, because of the effects that are of our effects on the environment, and it's making life for women worse, and it's making violence against women worse. And so we can't go on talking about social norms change as being something separate from SRH or something separate from economic strengthening. They're all part and parcel of the same story. Sorry for my croakiness. And so we've absolutely got to move beyond this. We can't actually take business as usual anymore, because business as usual is actually what's creating the problem. And the M&E process, which has been globally adopted in relation to RCTs around social norms change, around sex and reproductive health and rights, is just not fit for purpose. It's fine, of course, for testing medication or for testing vaccines, absolutely critical. But when it comes to these socio-economic political drivers, which are linking all of these different aspects, we can't take the existing measurements and say that they are suitable. We have to move on. We have to find, we have to make use of locally defined priorities created by women themselves in communities. What matters to them? What is of priority to them? And there are models out there. For example, you saw the picture from Bhutan. There's the happiness index in Bhutan. There are women's own perceptions of how they find contraceptives, for example, rather than being defined by health centers. There's many different examples which we give in the thought piece, which we'd really encourage you to go back and read further. So it's a really important question. I'm sorry it's taken so long to answer it, but it really involves all of these things being joined together.
Thank you, Alice. And no problem with the time. I think what you're bringing forth is so much of the complexity and interrelatedness of all of these concepts and how delicately we need to engage with them. I see another question in chat from Devin, and I'm going to ask Tavisha and Tina to respond. I'll read it out. How do others negotiate the pressure from government allies, donors, well-funded international non-governmental organizations to expand in traditional linear fashion? If an intervention is successful in 100 communities, many will ask, why not expand to 1,000? But issues outlined here today of accountability, capacity, fidelity make such linear expansion impossible or wholly undesirable. How do we break free from this thinking and collectively respond to these pressures so the integrity of our interventions is not sacrificed in our scale up, as Laura puts it? Tavisha, can you start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Anjali, and thanks, Devin, for a great question. I think I can think of two things while responding to this question. One is, I think all practitioners and program designers know a lot about their program and they understand their methodology very well. And over the years, they have kind of picked up this knowledge, which we call practice-based knowledge, over the cumulative period of implementing and designing a methodology. So I think I would encourage practitioners to know that they know their program well and write it out, or understand what needs to be done for their program to be implemented well. Like, what are some of the main things that is important to be done well for to say that we are implementing with fidelity and with integrity. So I think just valuing your own knowledge, and then also throughout this period, aligning on these values with the partners that you're working on and letting them know that it's important to have these things done in a certain way for a program to get the outcomes it's aiming for. So I think valuing the practice-based knowledge that you have gained over the years of implementing, and then also having an iterative learning approach where you keep learning from scaling up. So as you're going from 100 schools to a more number of schools, trying to understand, will the same approach work? Like if you scale it up, like what works, what doesn't work, and being agile and adaptive in how you are expanding and being open to different forms of scaling up and not just linear. And I'll pass it on to Tina to add to that.
Yes, thank you, Tavisha. In addition to what Tavisha said, I think at this point in time, I would say we are lucky to be at a time when there's evidence of what works. The whole of CUSP programs here have shown that evidence of what effective programming is. And then also the DFID funded project, What Works One, also has quite a number of evidence-based models. And there's a lot of similarity of what the CUSP methodologies have shown, how there's a lot of similarity in the components that make these models effective. So that's the starting point. We have evidence for reference purposes of what works. And then secondly, with the CUSP reflections, we learned, because a lot of our models were taken to scale in, for lack of a better term, just imagining that you can use this model to reach millions of people without really following a certain process. And we found that there was harm being created if the scaling up is not done in an ethical way. Mm-hmm. So we need to be mindful that what we are doing is transformative work. And therefore, if we have to be transforming, we have to have ethical scale. And we've learned through the very many years, all of us here in CUSP, our programs have been around for more than 15 years. That's such a long time, grounded within the communities. And we've learned about what works and what may be harmful. And that's why we are saying every colleague, and because we are accountable to women and girls, that's why we bring our learning here, so that everyone listens in and looks back inward to see if you're taking your program to scale. Is it really transforming, or it's resulting into unintended outcomes? So those are things that we need to speak with donors to be mindful of. It's not just about how much money are you spending, or are you running the program from 2 years and end at that. The goal is transformation and preventing violence. If we have to get there, our CUSP learning and evidence gives us the why and how to get there. And I think those are points of negotiation that we need to be raising. And we've had case studies that we saw where our methodologies were taken to scale without following, ethical scale. And we saw the harm that created, which was just against the intention of the programs. Yes, I think that's what I can add to Trisha's reflections. Over.
Thank you so much, Tina. Laura, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the question as well. I know you work so much on Scale Up.
So, and the question being, just tell me, Anjali, the question as you see it now after those reflections.
Or even your reflections on what Trisha and Tina are saying would be welcome.
Well, scaling up is complicated. It's not a linear path like everybody is saying. And I was trying to indicate there are always these trade-off choices that we need to make. And the fact is that we need to be very examined about them. And I think that when people are asking us to go from 10 to 100 to 1,000, they may not fully grasp, what we're facing when we try to think about such an endeavor. We need to really feel empowered sometimes to push back on such a request, because the fact is that explosive scale up is not always safe scale up, as Tina is saying, and we really have to be cautious about that. We want to be balanced and examined in our approaches so that we are doing no harm. And this is definitely something that ExpandNet really echoes again and again, and really wants everybody to be very thoughtful and, systematic in the scaling up process. And just one more thought is that it's an argument for why good documentation, which we already heard, but also continued monitoring and periodic evaluation is so important, because that's how we're going to pick up where some of these problems are. So yeah, over to everyone.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think you've set us up nicely for our final question. Lori, I'm going to pass it to you, so I'll read it out. More recently, there has been a move by some donors and philanthropists to put more money behind gender equity. This is an important shift, especially as funds may be more accessible to women's rights organizations and movements. There is a risk that those efforts will push for scale up, try to turn movements into projects, and assess success using benchmarks that do not translate to movements. How does this thought piece encourage those donors to act differently in partnerships?
Yes, that's $1 million question. Thank you. And I think, yeah, a lot of the funders on the call are probably chuckling and thinking, oh dear, that's right. And I think, you know, I would say like this is what we're trying to do is enter sort of a brave new world around this and a new way of thinking about it. And it's going to require us to sort of rethink some of the tried and truths of our sector. So instead of thinking about, you know, how many people we get, we start asking questions about how deep is it rooted within people, this change, how people have really started to activate this in their own lives. What are the institutions that can support it? I think we have to really think, you know, really just get out of the numbers mindset. It's not really working, right? And so more and more projects that are just trying to reach more and more people, you know, I think that that's why we discussed it so much length within CUSP about why we need those values as a core part. Because if we don't have those values as a core part of doing this work, then we're going to, as a field, continue to implement project after project after project and not really get anywhere in terms of long-term sustainable change. So it's a hard shift. It's uncomfortable. We're not used to it, but actually we all are committed to longer term social norm change. And we can only do that if we really start setting up what it takes for social change rather than projects. And so it's really a shift, I think, in mindset from a project-based mindset to a movement mindset, and recognizing that lots of different organizations can play different roles in doing different kinds of work that's rooted and grounded and based in feminist principles and really accountable. And then slowly that builds, right? That builds momentum for change. And we can't, you know, various organizations can and individuals and funders can support movement work, recognizing, again, if we're all part of a bigger new idea that we're all working toward, rather than what we're doing now is often very inward looking, thinking about our own individual projects and wanting to make that successful, but actually taking a bit more expansive look into how we can push social change a little bit more. And I'm sure if other CUSP members have something to say about that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lori. I'm not hearing from anyone else, and I know we're getting close to our end time. So I just want to take a minute and thank all of our CUSP members who presented today and the members who did not, but really upheld us throughout this process. This has been a starting point for us. We really wanted to invigorate a new conversation, envision a new future together, and really think about what structured and systems change looks like. It's not easy, but it is possible. I also want to thank Sybil and Laura for their insightful reflections and participation. It's very inspiring to hear your words. And then mostly I want to thank all of you for being here, for spending the time with us. I hope you have time to read the blog, to read our thought piece, to engage with us as we move forward in this field and really start to realize some of this work together. Lori has put another Menti poll in the chat, and this is a place, Leah, you can put the slides up so people can see the links. We welcome your feedback. That's a poll just to get some feedback from everybody so we can hear how this is resonating with you as we start to work forward. And then finally, I want to say we did record this session and we will be sharing the recording with everybody, and you can find our links on these websites here. So thank you so much. We're now at the end of our time. Thank you so much for everybody's reflections and participation today. And hopefully this is a beginning of a journey together. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Did you want us to stay on?
No, thank you. I'm just trying to close the webinar, but thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This was a really great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Sybil.
Sybil.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Sybil and
Thank you.
Laura, for your contributions. We really appreciate
Very
them.
good.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Yes, no problem. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
And
You
you.
too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.